Welcome to the Parker Avery Group's Talk Retail to Me podcast and new for 2023 video series. In each episode, our consulting professionals cover key retail and CPG topics and offer pragmatic insights that will add value to your operations and initiatives. This is Tricia Gustin, Senior Director of Marketing for the Parker Avery Group. Today, we are taking a deep dive into allocation and replenishment. Coming off the heels of Shoptalk, where so many people are still reaching for the shiny tech, we always need to make sure the basics of retail are covered so those customer-facing innovations actually work and deliver a great customer experience. Allocation and replenishment is one area with its share of innovations like integrations to AI-driven demand forecasting, but also brings lots of opportunities to increase internal and external efficiencies and result in better inventory management and visibility. Today, I am fortunate to be joined by three retail experts, Nia McDonald, Mike Johnson, and Dave Seeley. All are senior managers with Parker Avery and have been deep into client work focused on allocation and replenishment. But let's start off with introductions. I will hand the mic over to Nia to start us off.
Hi, my name is Nia McDonald. I've been with the Parker Avery Group for almost 2 years, coming out of industry, spent the majority of my career in planning and, of course, starting in allocation, as most of us, if not all of us in planning do. So, of course, it's near and dear to my heart. Started at BCBG as an allocator back in the day in LA, riding the BCBG bus. So very excited to talk today about allocation. So I will hand it over to Mike Johnson.
My name is Mike Johnson. I've been with the Parker Avery firm for about 3 years now. Spent most of my career prior to working with Parker Avery in industry, especially retail, sporting goods, and fashion apparel, focused on the planning, allocation, and replenishment side. So I also a topic near and dear to my heart and anxious to discuss it today. I'll hand it over to you, Dave.
Good afternoon, Dave Seeley. I've held various retail industry positions in buying, planning, reporting, and analytics, also including responsibility for managing allocation and replenishment teams. I went to the dark side, implemented those systems on the IT side. Been independent consulting for small and mid-sized retailers. Joined Parker Avery Group a little over a year ago and really enjoying the work and helping the clients improve their business.
Awesome. Thank you. So let's get into it. But let's start off first. Let's level set and describe kind of at a high level what allocation and replenishment are, as well as their importance to a retailer's success.
Okay, maybe I'll jump in and start with that. Allocation and replenishment are really the tail end of the entire merchandising process. A lot of work is done up front into developing and curating the assortment, understanding the promotions, and all of the tie-ins that are going to impact your business. But at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, it's really about getting that product to where you're going to sell it. And that's where the allocation and replenishment processes come into play. In many of the legacy environments that we find our clients in and is still prevalent in the industry, those processes are often disconnected, operated by multiple groups of people or different groups of people with different information. As we begin to evolve through all of the technology changes that have gone on in the last several years and responses to things in the marketplace, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, supply chain issues, it's become more and more important to look at and review these processes as one single process. So, just at a very simplified way, allocation is really about pushing inventory that you have or that's in your pipeline, and replenishment speaks more to pulling inventory based on need.
Awesome. Thank you. So what considerations do retailers take into account when selecting the best methods for allocation and replenishment?
Some of the things that are certainly important when you're considering what are the best ways to make sure that the product ends up in the hands of the people that want to buy it is consider those things that are impacting the process throughout the supply chain from procurement all the way through distribution. So you need to understand things like, what is the life cycle of an item? What is the availability of an item? Do I have a consistent ability to get product whenever I need it, or do I need to work with those that are producing the product based on their constraints to know what's available and when? These are important considerations, along with standard processes of seasonality, promotional activity, et cetera. But you need to really kind of think of all of these together when you're looking at what's the best way to fulfill the needs of your consumers.
One thing to throw in there, I know, Mike, you and I have talked about this at length about kind of the blurring of what allocation and replenishment is. Back in the day, there were solutions that was specific to allocation and specific to replenishment. When you did this, you use that system, and when you did that, you use that system. And I think over the years, through the technology advancement, things have changed, right? And there's a blending of that. And I know you have had clients experience that. So maybe just talk a little bit about what that experience is like.
One of the important considerations is who has access to the information, and who do you need to include in the process, as you're evaluating the really the criteria around how you're going to treat fulfillment. We talk about things like, vendor availability and how responsive can they be, and those type of answers will tell you, do I need to be thinking about this from a push or a pull perspective? If I'm looking at a constant flow of goods, which is optimal in terms of making sure my inventory productivity is high, I want to make sure that I'm fulfilling my need as regularly as possible. And that becomes more reliant on some of the information you talk about, Dave, in terms of some of the technologies that have improved over the years, in terms of forward-looking types of forecasts or demand, that can be used in the process, as opposed to a lot of the legacy environments where we're really reliant on just sales history, not a whole lot else. It was just slicing and dicing that history in different ways to try and get the answer. And I think that now, when you're looking at making those decisions, along with, working with the procurement, the buying teams and the planning teams to understand timing and, what is the best way to manage my inventory, those are decisions you have to think about up front. And also, it's not just a fire and forget. It's the ways that you look at fulfillment may change over the life cycle of an item. From an assortment perspective, it may start out as where the plan is to buy it once and fill it in once or twice and program those orders out. But as you're responding to demand, it may say that, I thought this was a 3 or 6 month item, and it could be a year and a half item or a 2-year item. And my decisions around how to fulfill that may change, and I may want to move from a push to a pull. And that's some of the considerations that are important as you initially set your assortment and your fulfillment plan, but also as you adapt, as you learn more and more about the performance and how important those items become.
Think about the product too, right? So think of a gold toe sock, right? What kind of demands that has versus, say, a fashion jean, right? Where you have, you can order a sock in a minute and have it there in a week versus something that you're going to take 6 weeks to get back into. And those situations about product itself, I think one of the best practices is really being able to triage the type of product that you're doing and lead, the team through the discussion so that you make the right decision. And that's a super important area, and not where I think a lot of people have some challenges, is making those distinctions.
Lately, we've been talking to clients a lot about, tearing down silos and collaborating more internally and externally. And it sounds like what you all have been just talking about, as far as, initially setting the allocation replenishment cadence and then reviewing it as throughout the product life cycle. Sounds like collaboration would be in play. Those. How would you describe some best practices relative to merchant planner collaboration when it comes to allocation and replenishment?
I think, Tricia, you were picking up exactly what Mike and Dave were going, is what you were picking up in terms of that question, right? That adaptation and changing the intention, right? So from a best practices, and this is something just very simple, communication, right? In terms of the merchant planner allocator replenishment relationship, just simple communication between those groups is key. It's necessary. The merchant strategy, in terms of the product strategy, in terms of the promotional strategy, can change in an instant. something that could be a long life cycle product can become something that you decide to cut off because it's not selling. And without communicating that strategy to the allocation team, to the replenishment team, to the planning team that's putting that financial strategy in place, could completely kill either the product or kill your financial strategy. So I think from a tearing down silos and a best practice, simple communication, putting merchant notes in, communicating those merchant notes, having weekly meetings where you're following up with those merchant notes is something that's simple that we've seen take place in client meetings, client sort of just overall culture that I think has taken them a long way in terms of making sure that their overall business strategies and overall financial needs are met. Mike, is that something that you've seen sort of move the needle? Something simple, but yet
it's a
moves the
great
needle.
point. I think it's, there are a number of ways that you can facilitate that type of communication. It can be old fashioned. It can be tapping the person on the shoulder and saying, hey, you know what, we decided to make a change in the assortment. So, as you're looking at your, future demand or your forecasted orders, you need to keep that in mind. Some of it comes out, with being able to communicate life cycle of an item. Ideally, those are types of things that, from a technology standpoint, you'd love that to be able to be visible within the allocation replenishment process without requiring, manual communication. But you can achieve the same goals, whether you have that type of capability, within the system or not. The importance is that constant communication, the understanding of intent. I think that over the years, we've seen a lot of focus on collaboration earlier in the merchandising process. I mean, there's been a lot of focus over the years on assortment planning and making sure that the intent is collaborated upon the planning and buying at those stages. And I think it's taken a lot longer for those type of collaborations and communications to filter down to the final stages of execution, which is replenishment and allocation. So I think leveraging those type of culture changes that you're speaking to, Nia, will be very important to not drop the ball at the goal line, and that's kind of where you're at with deciding the final execution strategies.
One thing to add, I think that's clear, is that and for those of us who've been around for a while and have seen a lot of different systems over the years, that while the technology has improved and changed, we were talking going back many years, the fundamentals like this don't change. And we walk into clients every day and you find, well, buyer, planner, allocator don't seem to talk, right? Or their roles aren't clear and they didn't know what this is or what that is. And as a result, you have dysfunction and bad decisions. So that goes along with any of the products and services we provide. But I think that's a clear message as part of what we do.
That unfortunately is still a prevalent problem. And there's, I think, another silo that we don't speak enough about, and it's not just in the merchandising and planning organization, right? I think it's between the supply chain organization and the merchandising planning organization. Those are not organizations that often speak to each other, right? When we were in planning, I don't think I really ever met anybody in supply chain, but we don't really look at it as an entire supply chain strategy, right? Allocation, replenishment, that should be part of a broader supply chain overall strategy where we could be more both efficient and cost effective and make our entire organization, I think, more optimal. We did a project for a client where there was some suboptimal POs going out the door, a lot of PC onesie twosies, right? Where there was opportunity to optimize the carton flow, improve some efficiencies, and just overall reduce some supply chain costs. And it was just something that was not forefront in a buyer's mind, a planner's mind, an assistant planner's mind, because that's not conversations that are had. So I think there's opportunity just overall to have operational costs as part of a conversation when you're looking at your allocation and your replenishment strategy. And as Mike mentioned, as part of the conversation early on at the forefront, right? It shouldn't be a conversation farther down the path. We shouldn't be asking the allocator to do it or a replenishment person to look at it on a weekly basis, but you should be talking about that when you're setting your overall strategy early on. So those are silos that also should be part of a conversation in the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it really comes down to right products, right place, right time. I mean, so
Right
the
amount.
customer, when the customer is ready to buy, the retailer is in a position to buy. And of course, that's demand forecasting and down to those different, what in many cases are functional silos, but it shouldn't be. It should be sort of this more integrated functional collaboration going on. If some people call it integrated business planning, down to those, different areas. But tell me how the demand signal can be leveraged for allocation and replenishment, and maybe touch on some of those leading practices that we've seen or should be seeing.
So I can jump in. Let's take about what kind of old school would be. If you were running an allocation or replenishment system, it's usually backward looking. It is saying, hey, I'm going to take a look at the last 10 weeks and I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to sell X amount. And usually it's a formula looking only at prior history as a basis to do your, what they'll call need calculation, which how am I going to sell going forward? And that's pretty much, it was, that way for many, many years. With the advance of demand forecasting and technology and computing power, we introduced things called like a demand signal, which is really a forward-looking view of what I think I'm going to sell. And that's what our game is here in allocation replenishment. If you know what you're going to sell or have a better estimate of it, and where to put it in the locations or the warehouses, you're going to get a better result. You're going to get better return. You're going to get better profitability. And, so the introduction of that thing is a game changer when it comes to this topic.
I think I'll build on to what you were mentioning, Dave. I think, one of the important things to understand as you talk about this unified demand signal or this demand is that it's becoming more and more prevalent that you will need this for the fulfillment process. And especially as we talked about earlier, kind of the blending of allocation replenishment, in legacy environments where you would only see some type of a forecast often in a replenishment system, and you really wouldn't see that forward-looking forecast in an allocation system or process. And now, because retailers are looking for ways to be more nimble in those decisions, having a single source of the truth in terms of what's causing that demand and that need, whether your criteria define that as a replenishment or a pull versus a push, being able to leverage that same demand and utilize it for different processes makes it a lot more efficient. And we certainly know that efficiency is important, and being able to open up time for those people that are responsible for the fulfillment to be able to analyze their business and be a little bit less tactical, where so many of the legacy environments, you're having to do a lot of those combinations or a lot of those thought processes either outside of a system or augmenting a system with manual work. And so, leveraging that single view of demand for multiple purposes, and even, taking it beyond just allocation replenishment, if that can be leveraged for other organizations, there's just a lot of benefit in being able to leverage that for multiple purposes.
One other topic to throw in there, I know for those who have operated in big chain stores as well as department stores, low rates of sale is one of the biggest challenges that you deal with. And I think it's a good discussion because, I would say that, many of the demand signal solutions out there struggle with that. When you're selling one unit every 10 weeks, which is not uncommon in some of these bigger organizations, the ability of that demand solution to be able to accommodate that and have better logic for it is super important for especially these bigger guys.
Once inventory is in the supply chain, needs to be directed to the correct places. How are leading retailers addressing the inventory visibility piece and then reacting to demand fluctuations? I mean, COVID was a fantastic example with the toilet paper and then, all that kind of stuff that happened. Nobody was prepared for that. How are they now able to handle these demand fluctuations with the existing inventory on hand?
I think one of the important things that it's always easy to overlook but impossible to ignore is the simple concept of inventory accuracy and timeliness is critical to certainly the allocation replenishment processes, along with everything else. Having an understanding of what you own right now and where you own it is really critical to any type of optimization that we're talking about from a fulfillment standpoint. I think, some of the other capabilities that are now kind of in scope for a lot of these processes are ways to optimize and rebound, again, leveraging that demand and that need, those need calculations that are informed from a forecasting perspective, is being able to utilize those to optimize the inventory that already exists. So, not all retailers or all organizations have the ability to move product between stores or between locations, but the capabilities to understand where is the best place for that inventory based on what I have now and what I expect to sell. It gives you more of an informed decision as opposed to trying to figure out and do the analysis offline of what type of movement or where it should be optimal. And the ability to take that type of information and leverage that into the forecasts for future buys so that you don't exacerbate a problem that exists and are able to react to it, using the levers that are available.
One thing that we see a fair amount is system gaps in this area, where you have inventory that is in between systems. Mm-hmm. So it may be in a warehouse, it may be in transition to the stores, but the allocation replenishment systems don't have visibility to that quantity. So they end up making bad decisions. And it is an integration challenge when we do the IT side of things, but a pretty common occurrence between a WMS system and your core merch and where that inventory is. So that's a gap we see a lot, and one we suggest to get fixed because it has a big impact.
How does that get fixed? That's a pretty vague term.
Well, having participated in some of the core merchandising work that we do, there's inventory statuses that are typically used. And it's really an integration between, okay, it's not in the DC, it's not in the store, it is in transit, right? So know that you're in transit and make that visible to your allocation replenishment, solution so that it knows. That's really it's a harder to execute. I said it very simply, but it is a really important piece of the system.
I think it's worth noting too, just to tag onto that, Dave, is that as we talk about solutions that are beginning to view the fulfillment process as a kind of a single process as opposed to fragmented, there is I think understanding from a lot of providers as well of the importance of transparency to where product is in the pipeline. And so things that may have not been top of mind in terms of where they're designing the data inputs for these systems, where these may not have been the case in legacy, very specific replenishment solutions or allocation solutions, because now it's becoming a lot more of a blended approach. The visibility is one of the key factors, and especially as Nia had mentioned earlier, of kind of integrating and collaborating with supply chain and finance. It becomes more and more important for all of those disciplines within the organization to understand where your inventory is, where it's going, and when it's going to get there. And I think that's really a critical piece to being able to really take advantage of the capabilities that are going to be out there.
Can we back up and talk about something that non-sexy piece, and that's the MDM and the PIM? If you don't start off with that data governance and that clean data that's in your core merch, none of what we're talking about is going to happen well, right?
That's one point, yes.
Can you all can we expand upon any of that?
Yeah, I think one of the critical things, and again, this is kind of a follow-up to some of the same type of conversations that have happened related to assortment planning or even item planning earlier in the process. Allocation replenishment is finally coming up to speed, I think, a little bit. But the structure of your hierarchy is critical. That you make sure that the structure supports the way your customers shop, the way that you need to understand where product is, and also talking about the forecasting piece. A lot of the solutions are primarily reliant on forecasting or generating these needs at levels within your hierarchy. So that's critically important, although I think we would all recognize that the hierarchy is not always going to be the end-all and be-all, which means it's important to be able to leverage product or location attributes, especially talking about fulfillment, replenishment allocation, because we're really talking about getting it to the end source. And so you're at the lowest level of granularity, you're generally at location or selling location and item. So being able to group those in meaningful ways and leverage, history or forecasts at those levels to create your need, I think is a very important piece of the puzzle.
And zero in on in relation to the demand forecasting piece, as part of the modeling, we will do basically demand drivers, which is your modeling based to understand response based on price, based on seasonality. And, so you test as part of this process. It's not automatic in any way, but that hierarchy and the attributes are really fuel to help support that. And the better, hierarchy you have, the more attributes that you have, more opportunity you have is to tailor your forecast, the more accurate it is. So it's become even more and more critical in the demand forecasting space, to Mike's point.
And even more foundational than that, Dave and Mike, right? We talked about just the accuracy of the sales data that you have feeding into your demand forecast.
Absolutely.
Your historical sales data.
An important piece of the discussion when we talked about that earlier, Nia, was the ability to handle, from a forecasting perspective, those sales history components that are not good. We certainly wouldn't want to build a forecast based on what happened during COVID. So it's like, how do you intelligently handle those gaps or lost sales or unreliable spikes? And that's where, as David mentioned, some of the modeling of these forecasts or the components that influence the forecast created for allocation replenishment are important to be able to help, mitigate those really, really bad history sections that we know exist.
And one thing we didn't talk about, but you mentioned, Tricia, was the whole supply chain piece. And that's one of the big constraints, especially during COVID, and especially during certain circumstances when you're maybe introducing a new product, you have constrained amount of stuff that the vendors have. So how do you manage that? And during COVID, when you're getting maybe half of the stuff that you ordered, how do you respond to that? And providing some logic and or reasoning on how to deal with that, and which stores do I send the stuff to? If I get half of what I ordered, do I give one to everybody? Do I give most to the people who sell it more? What are the decisions that you have to make? And those are, you can add systems and analysis and do work on that, but that comes a lot down to process and thinking about and working with the vendors, the best way to deal with those situations. But that, I think Mike and I've talked about that at length about what is the best way to deal with that. And it is a challenge today, and it probably will be going forward, but it is important.
Yeah, and it comes back to that being able to have that internal and external collaboration as well, so that everybody has the visibilities to those demand and supply, especially supply constraints, as witnessed during COVID. And who knows when the next disruption will be. But to have that collaboration in place, that communication that Nia really talked about earlier on, is so critical to be able to respond more quickly and more efficiently to those disruptions. If we've got listeners who are kind of trying to figure out where do they take the first step in getting their allocation or replenishment processes and even systems in a better place than where they are today, where should they take that first step?
I think that, it's not always easy or viable to say, I just need to go and get a new solution today. That may be an absolute need, but you can begin by really understanding what your business process is around allocation replenishment, and look and see, are there opportunities, even if if those exist today as silos or as different groups of people that don't communicate. I think it really goes back to understand what your process is, and then look for opportunities where you can embed all of the different players into the process in one, whether it's communication, whether it's collaboration on any of those topics that we talked about. But I think that's the place to start, is really, you need to understand, are your people talking? Are your people communicating today? And even if I am working in two disparate systems, that doesn't prevent me from sharing and collaborating on what needs to be done.
I would say that, just to pile onto that, more tactically speaking, do a self-diagnostic, right? Get a pen, get a whiteboard, get on a computer, start drawing some boxes about what you do today, and take the topics that we talked about today: demand, constraints, collaboration, and just write a grid out and assess yourself about how well you're doing, because a lot of these things are pretty right in front of your face. It's just the people get involved in your day-to-day operation, you're not able to look at it. And taking a step back, get a cup of coffee and a whiteboard, and I think you can get some good revelations.
I'm going to take a slightly different approach if it's okay. I'm going to give a first step for the person who's allocating, because usually this person is possibly straight out of college and they might be that entry level person, right? But we've already discussed, like, they're the last line of defense. They're the person driving the end of the strategy. But a lot of times they're the person with maybe the least positional power in the organization. So I'm gonna give them a first step. Get what you need, right? Go and make sure you have all of the elements and the components that we're telling you need. You need that promotional strategy. You need the hindsighting. You need to make sure that the merchant is giving you, the buyer is giving you all the information. You need to make sure that the financial planner, that you're working with that person, that you understand the replenishment strategy, that everybody that is talking, that should be talking, is talking to you, that to the extent that you can help drive the supply chain overall strategy, that you are helping to drive that mission. So that is my advice. My first step is to sort of empower that level.
All right, great. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate you all taking some time out of your Friday afternoon to talk on our Talk Retail to Me podcast. And we look forward to talking with you again later on in the year. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for this episode of Talk Retail to Me. If you have questions related to today's topic, please visit our website at parkeravery.com to learn more and to contact us. Also, we'd love it if you shared Talk Retail to Me with any of your colleagues. It's streaming on all the major podcast platforms, and the videos are available on our YouTube channel. For more Parker Avery industry expertise and advice, be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.